welcome to Waranara's Yuran. I'm recording from the Gadigal land in the heart of Sydney, Australia. Waranara is a Gadigal name meaning to seek, which sums up the mission of our Health Professions Education Research Network here at the University of Sydney. And Yuran means many voices, which our podcast represents. So I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging of all the lands on which we're present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening. With us is Andrew Bartlett, here to talk about his paper published in BMC Medical Education 2020, Series 20, Measuring and Assessing the Competence of Preceptors in Health Professions, a systematic scoping review with his colleagues Irene Edward Luca, Ines Krass and Carl Schneider. Hello, Andrew.
Hi, Lynn. How are you going?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
Good. Yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah, it's a good day today. I wonder if we could start off, if you could just tell us a little bit about the background of your research and the rationale that kind of led to you researching this for publication.
Yeah, sure. So my background has been, I'm a pharmacist, and so I've owned pharmacies for 25 years or so.
Wow.
And then transferred to the university after being a pharmacy owner.
That's quite a transition.
Yeah, it was a little bit different. But having owned pharmacies and employing new graduates, I've had a lot of students that have come through over the years, and as well as interns who spend a prolonged period of time with you. And coming to the university as well, seeing how our graduates go during their intern year and also their clinical placements led to some discussions around the consistency of the experience that the graduates get and how it can be really formative, positively or negatively for some students, and whether or not there could be a consistent approach to preceptorship that we could research. So that's where we came to this, and there had been some work done over the years. Ines Kraz and I had a conversation, and there had been a little bit of money earmarked at one stage for it, but it just hadn't progressed, and so I took that up.
Oh, so, those opportunities you cannot say no to.
That's right. Yeah.
Before we go into the nuts and bolts of your paper, Andrew, I wonder if we can have a discussion around your publishing strategies. I'm really interested in what makes people decide to publish in certain places. So what made you decide to submit to BMC Medical Education?
I guess medical education was the field that we were aiming for, and we wanted to get to the right audience. We initially thought of some pharmacy journals, because as a rapid review, which is how it was originally written, it was probably a little bit more focused into the pharmacy profession, but we wanted a little bit more impact and maybe a broader audience. So initially we went to academic medicine, who weren't that keen on a rapid review. They were looking for something else. And Advances in Health Science Education also were looking for something other than the rapid review. So taking some feedback on board from reviewers, we still wanted to look at that audience was still who we were looking for. So we did do some changes to the study, and it became a systematic scoping review.
Okay.
And so we tried some other journals and ended up with BMC Medical Education. Yeah.
That's interesting. So you began with a rapid review and some that wasn't well received. So I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about what's the difference between a rapid review and a scoping review.
Well, a rapid review is generally done in response to a particular question or policy area. So there'd be a stimulus, and in this case there was a COAG report that said that there was no oversight process in place for preceptors in pharmacy, and that a system of feedback would be desirable. And so that was our stimulus, and we decided that in response, we could try and answer that question and come up with a recommendation.
Just to hold you there, for the audience that are a little bit more broader than maybe Australia, do you want to say who COAG is?
COAG is the Commonwealth, like the representatives of the Commonwealth states. Uh-huh. So they all get together and have a discussion on a number of areas. Health is one, and so they had gotten together to discuss how health professions are accredited.
Right.
And so this was from one of their papers that they'd put out. So that led us to being in a small research group with not a lot of resources. Rapid reviews are useful because they can be done with single reviewers, and there are some shortcuts that you can take that they're still rigorous and you're still following a process, a PRISMA process, but nevertheless you can shorten the time frame and come up with some quite specific recommendations.
So what are the kind of shortcuts that you might take?
So single reviewer for that aspect. The risk of bias assessment is often not done, although I actually wanted to do that. So in some ways it wasn't a strictly traditional rapid review. I probably put some extra processes in place. So I guess they're the main shortcuts that you can take. With a scoping review, we took out, to make it a scoping review, we took out the specific stimulus and made it a little bit broader to all health professions rather than pharmacy.
So did that mean you had to do more searches and?
Well, I had done the searches, so I had all the information. I just had to change some inclusion criteria, and we probably included some other articles. So it wasn't a lot of extra, data extraction for it. It's just probably the application was a little bit broader.
Okay. And so once you'd undertaken those things, I mean, how long was that a lengthy process for you?
It was. I started off doing it full time, so it was a fair bit of time was put into it, and I guess overall it probably was 6 months or more.
Yeah. And when you changed it from being a rapid review to a scoping review, did that change your findings at all?
Rather than just saying this is our recommendation for an accreditation process, we were really coming up with some ideas around how assessments could be measured, but then who would also be doing those assessments, and then a possible assessment framework that could be developed afterwards as a further piece of research.
Right. So the subject of your work is competence, measuring and assessing the competencies of preceptors in health professions. And I wonder if, there's a new kind of, not so new perhaps, and there's another term that we might use around this area, which is more about capabilities. And I think the argument is that capabilities, well, can you ever be competent at anything? Because each situation is very different and things may arise that you hadn't anticipated, but having a capability allows you to work within that space. So why did you think about competencies rather than capabilities?
Well, I guess competencies are the things that had been identified in literature. So they were the things that we could pull out. What I did pull out also, though, was a number of attributes of preceptors, or good preceptors, and qualities of preceptors.
Okay.
So I guess in one regard they could be considered to lead to those capabilities.
Absolutely.
Things like empathy and role modelling. I guess they're difficult to measure, which is generally competencies we can measure them. but how do we develop those attributes? Are they intrinsic, or do we model that behaviour and people just see what it is and take it on board? I'm not sure. That's some of those things are still to be answered, I think, but that's my feeling.
And maybe they're part of a broader person, your experience as a person across your life course as well.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I guess having some of those intrinsic abilities may mean that you are more capable of dealing with situations that you come across in your career.
So thinking about the competencies that you were looking at, what kind of framework or frameworks did you use and why?
One of the part of our research that's ongoing is really developing a competency framework, assessment framework. I guess what we were interested in this is really the alignment of using some constructive alignment ideas and also what lens we're looking at if we are assessing. So we wanted to make sure that what you're measuring is the right thing. Is it meaningful? And then who's actually doing it? Is it a valid perspective to look at it from?
Okay, do you want to tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so there was some inconsistencies that we found in the literature about some of the competencies and who was the one assessing them. For example, demonstrating reflective practice is a competency that comes up a number of times in the literature, but how it's been measured is from a preceptor, the preceptee, assessing the preceptor, which is kind of the wrong perspective. Like a reflective practice to me would be something that I actually would, if I'm prompted, I might actually question myself about whether I'm practicing in that way. It's very hard for a preceptee to see that that's what's being done.
Particularly if there's no guidelines around defining what reflection and reflective practice is.
Yeah. So there was another competency that was about how you relate to your student and whether you're adapting to the student's learning needs, and that was the evidence for that was about a peer observation, where I felt like that's probably something that the student or the intern would be the perspective that should be gathered on that sort of competency.
Or maybe getting a little bit more of a 360 around that one as well.
Yeah. So one of the things that came out of this was that we need to have a bit more of a view, an all-round view, and having one survey doesn't really answer all the questions that we might have, and having a few different perspectives that we meld together might be the way that we get an overall picture of competency.
So I know you've already started to tell me a little bit about what you found, but without giving everything away, was there any surprises in your findings?
There was definitely some interesting things. One interesting thing that came out was the idea of measuring a student's exam performance and trying to track that back to the competence of the preceptor.
Okay.
So there was a study that was done that took the high performing students, and they also then rated their preceptors as highly rated or average or below, but they didn't quantify what that was. But the students with higher marks in their final exams generally had higher rated preceptors.
So there's correlation going on.
There's a bit of a correlation, but the further work to identify what it is that makes them highly rated wasn't done in that study. But I think it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, and I wonder what else could be associated with that. If obviously correlation is not causation, and I'm wondering if you're a particularly good student, you're very confident and competent about what you're doing, that you see your senior in that way as well, or they don't have so much work to do perhaps. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, that's all possible. whether the highly rated preceptors search out those interns as well.
Yeah,
I don't know.
That's another one.
So I guess one of the other interesting things was about some of the studies comparing self-assessment versus the preceptee's assessment on the same criteria, and how differently people self-assess themselves.
So, in what way did you which direction was that? Was it greater, lesser?
Well, things like communication skills are overrated in self-assessment.
Okay.
I guess in some ways that's not surprising, but provision of feedback as well being overrated as a self-assessment. They're quite stark differences.
Okay.
I assumed that they would be differences, but not as great a difference as what I saw.
Interesting. And generally, were self-assessments higher, or?
I think in those aspects they were, yes.
But more generally in other
areas, they were much closer. Yeah.
Okay.
And considered to be a valid.
We have a group of school children walking past, by the way. I don't know if our audience can hear this. It's very charming.
Self-assessment definitely showed a lot of validity and consistency. It's just that you've got to keep in mind that the caveat that a preceptor will tend to overestimate some of those criteria.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, Andrew, what's next for you?
So what's next is taking some of those findings, and we've done a number of focus groups interviews. We've interviewed about 50 pharmacists and students in focus groups.
That's good.
Just asking them what it is about preceptorship that they valued, how they feel about being assessed as a preceptor, some of the qualities that they would feel as desirable in preceptors, and also about accreditation, how they feel about accreditation. So we're kind of out of that. We're still writing that up at the moment, but we need to be aware that the more restrictions you put on, or the more barriers that you put in, can have some consequences for things like how many people might put their hand up to be part of it.
Yeah.
So we've got to think about balancing those things.
Okay.
So that's one stage, and the next stage is developing some consensus around what those competencies should be. So that's another study that's in the process at the moment.
That sounds fantastic. Well, Andrew, let me know when you're publishing your next one, and we'll have another podcast on that one.
Sure, definitely.
So thank you very much for talking with us today.
My pleasure.
So I've been here with Dr. Andrew Bartlett, talking about his paper published in BMC Medical Education 2020, entitled Measuring and Assessing the Competencies of Preceptors in Health Professions, a Systematic Scoping Review, with his colleagues Irene Edward Luca, Ines Kranz and Carl Schneider.